Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel. Today I called out of work because I had a terrible migraine, decided that it was not worth trying to push through the day. And I took a 3-hour long nap and I woke up and I decided that I wanted to do a readathon because I've been doing a lot of writing, super exciting, but I have not been doing a lot of reading and I think it's time to pick her back up. I have a couple of classic literature books that I'm reading or that I want to read and all of that stuff. But I decided that I wanted to dive into a different kind of classic literature, which is going to be classic sci-fi. Sci-fi has always been one of my favorite genres. That was what I primarily read in high school. I love science fiction. I did read the very problematic Heinlein, which we'll probably be going over at some point in this channel, but not as like you should definitely read this kind of thing. But Frankenstein is one of my favorite books. And I will be doing a reread of that and doing a full deep dive video on Frankenstein. There was just so much to it. It's a little bit daunting to think about. But in my physical TBR, which is ridiculous since starting this channel, I might add, I'm going to be reading Brave New World by Aldous Huxley. And I'm not going to do a full deep dive on this book, but I will take you along with me for the ride. So hopefully you enjoy this and let me know what other science fiction books you want me to read. I am currently in the middle of the Expanse series. I could probably read that in one sitting, so I'm trying to space it out so that way I can hold on to it for longer. But for today, we'll be reading Brave New World, and hopefully I can finish this book in one day, which really shouldn't be a problem as long as I don't get distracted because we are unmedicated. But I'm very excited to be filming some content for you guys because for the last while I have been absorbed in writing and working and bettering myself physically. And so I have been reading, but a lot of it I have not been, I wanted to say videotaping, filming. And this little pet project, taking you guys with me while I expand my reading horizons, is something that I am still passionate about. So let's get into it. A mid-book check-in. So I'm about 120, well, I'm exactly 120 pages into 259. I've been reading for about 2 hours with a couple of breaks. This is a pretty easy read. Honestly, I'm having no trouble getting through this. There are a couple of parts that I've tabbed. Well, actually, I guess I should tell you what the book is about. Basically, A Brave New World is IVF to the extreme. Everyone is test tube babies. The government controls everything, and everyone goes through this conditioning to cement their role in society and what they want to do, what their thoughts are, all of that stuff. So epsilons are like the lowest caste, and they're basically the sewage workers, and so on and so forth. So it's really interesting that it still applies even today when we think about propaganda and the government conditioning us and consumerism. Also, the ethical implications of genetic testing and changing genetics. I currently work in fertility, so this is specifically applicable to my line of work. I also remember probably about 6 years ago, whenever I was in college, I did an essay on why I don't agree with people opting for CRISPR. And now it's actually ironic that I work in fertility because ethically at the time I was against it. And now people do genetic testing on their embryos all the time to pick the best ones. Now, obviously, when I wrote that essay, it was a lot more along the lines of picking eye color and picking the fastest and picking the smartest and all of that stuff. Like, we can't do that. We can only test for hereditary conditions and chromosomal abnormalities. But the question remains is, should we be doing that? Because we're going to potentially create a physical divide, as even more so than it is currently, as far as a class system of people, right? Because these days you are still looking at the poor people who are disabled in one way or another, right? And we try to have services to, you know, fix that, accommodations and all that stuff. And that's why those things are so important. But if we, as a society, if the rich, well-off people can pick embryos that are the smartest and the healthiest, then we are creating a society in which people like Stephen Hawking wouldn't exist, right? Because people like Stephen Hawking wouldn't have been able to have access to the things that gave him the status that he did. So it doesn't matter how smart you are, because these people that are born are not going to have the ability to be smart, right? So whatever, the whole thing, I don't know if I'm going to put all of that in the video, because this is very unscripted, so it may be coming out very like unintelligently. I was not prepared to have this conversation, even though I knew exactly what kind of book I was reading, but alas. So it's really cool. It's really cool that this is still applicable even today. I understand why it holds up. I understand why it's considered a classic. The science in it is shaky at best, but that's what science fiction is. It's okay that it's not like Aldous Huxley does not go into detail about how this works. He kind of just explains the machinations of it, but not the science behind it, which is totally fine. There are a couple of passages that I want to read. Oh, and the plot. So I'm going to do this spoiler free, mostly because I don't really know how this book ends, but we're living in this utopian society where your caste is assigned when you as an embryo are fertilized, and you go through conditioning to be okay and content with what your caste is. And the way that you are genetically engineered to be in that caste means that you could be strong, and there are like physical characteristics. So like alpha pluses are strong, attractive. It seems like they're also white, and they're tall, and they're intelligent, and they're intelligent because they have to do the conditioning, they have to do the propaganda and all of that stuff. So they need to have that. Oh, brain's not working today. Migraine's still in effect, but that's okay. So anyway, it seems like as of right now, as of halfway through the book, this is following two people, Lenina and Bernard. Bernard seems to have not taken to his conditioning very well. So he's kind of miserable. He wants to remain miserable. He is basically trying to find the answer of like, what, like, I want to be free, but I don't really know what that means. I don't know how to achieve that. And Lenina, in contrast, is very comfortable with her conditioning. They are kind of trying to, at least as of right now, they are courting each other. There's a very stark contrast into, like, you know, Bernard wants to be alone, and Lenina sees no point in being alone because she doesn't really have thoughts outside of her conditioned reactions to the environment, right? Where Bernard wants to think for himself, and that's not a very common thing. So throughout this book, there have been a couple of things that I've found very interesting so far. The first thing is this quote, and that, put in the director sententiously, that is the secret of happiness and virtue, liking what you've got to do. All conditioning aims at that, making people like their unescapable social destiny. Seems very applicable to today's time, but also it made me think, because in a way I do agree with that. Now, I think it's important to make the distinction that I don't think that there is an unescapable societal destiny. It's definitely hard to break out of these like predetermined social levels that, you know, we're all born into. But liking what you've got to do, all conditional aims at that, making people like their unescapable social destiny. It's like liking what you do for work, right? I think that there's like a nuanced conversation to be had about being content with what you have. And in this highly capitalistic society, I kind of think that this is the opposite of that. If you have enough, why do you need more? And that's my reading of it. Obviously, it's not written that way, but out of context, I think that this can still be something to aim for. We should, in my opinion, be conditioning ourselves to be content with what we have, and then also want to strive for more. I don't think those things are mutually exclusive. And we also often see that in our consumerist society, right? So we're always striving to get more money, to get the next thing, because we are unhappy with ourselves. And if we are happy with ourselves, then maybe that next thing doesn't seem as necessary. If you're trying to make more money to become more comfortable, to, you know, improve your life, period, because obviously quality of life is tied to how much money we make, like, duh, then that's one thing, right? But these people who are already making enough money to live comfortably and are still stuck in this cycle of needing to make more so that they could buy more, so that they can increase their social status, that is directly a symptom of like late stage capitalist consumerism. And so I think that there is something to be said for this quote, liking what you've got to do. You know, like, I still have a 9 to 5. I have to work a 9 to 5. I am learning to be content with the fact that I will be working a 9 to 5 for the rest of my life. My job doesn't suck, right? And putting out of my mind like this idea of like mansions and on acres and acres and helicopters. It's like, I don't need those things. It doesn't make sense for me to want those things. And I think we have to decondition ourselves as a society, right? Like, I don't need a bigger house. The bigger house would be just simply a social status symbol. I don't need that. I could use better healthcare. I can work toward getting better healthcare, right? But the difference between making more money because genuinely my quality of life is affected versus making more money because I'm going to feel like a social pariah, those are not the same thing. And it's taken a lot, and I still continue to try to decondition myself into thinking that I need something that I definitely don't need, and just like defining what a need is. You know, I need clean water, I need a house, but what do I need in order to feel good about myself? I need money to, you know, partake in some of my hobbies, but am I actually partaking in my hobbies, or am I just collecting expensive things, right? And we see this trend in different combinations and permutations online. You know, we go from, oh, I'm coloring, to getting $200 Ohuhu markers, obviously not sponsored, and, you know, hoarding all of these coloring books that we never finish. And now that's become a status symbol. And it's very hard to detach consumerism from everything that we do. And on top of that, it's basically impossible to do anything for free. So, you know, it's not something that I disparage myself or other people for struggling with, but I think it is a question that we constantly have to be asking ourselves as a society. Anyway, continuing. And it's also really cool that this book makes me think about that. So, point for that. The writing is very simple. I wouldn't say it's bad, but it's not like the prose aren't anything special. I do think that this is a really good book to get into as someone who may want to start reading classic literature. This is obviously a genre-specific book, but it is considered classic literature. And if you are trying to get into classic lit from sci-fi, this is definitely a very good bridge. I think that Frankenstein, although I highly recommend it, the prose are beautiful, but they could be difficult for someone who is not used to reading Victorian prose. So this would probably, it's easier to go from like modern classics back to the originals instead of starting at the originals and then working the opposite way if you're used to reading kind of like blockbuster modern books. So as of right now, this is pretty high on the list of recommendations for beginner classic readers or whatever. And eventually I'm going to do like a whole deep dive into it. But anyway, the next quote is on page 41, and it says, "No wonder these poor pre-moderns were mad and wicked and miserable. Their world didn't allow them to take things easily, didn't allow them to be sane, virtuous, happy. What with mothers and lovers and with the prohibitions they were not conditioned to obey. What with the temptations and the lonely remorses, that with all these diseases and endless isolating pain, what with the uncertainties and the poverty they were forced to feel strongly, and feel strongly, and strongly what was more in solitude, in hopelessly individual isolation, how could they be stable?" Once again, I agree with what this is saying. Like, of course we're having trouble in this society, but for different reasons, right? This book is saying, well, the passage is saying us as pre-moderns compared to the time period in the book struggle because we aren't conditioned. And I say, well, why are we putting these prohibitions on and poverty into the race at all? They are not necessary evils. This book is helping me understand my views a lot more clearly. And that's something that I really like this book is challenging me and also inspiring me to have more fleshed out, fully well-rounded ideas about what I want for society and what I think society should look like. And for that, oh no, my sticky. And for that, I applaud the book. What came into this with skeptical optimism, and I am pleasantly surprised. It's one of those things where a lot of the time you have to be willing to be inspired by a piece of literature, because I could read this and I could think, okay, well, it's really cool that this was like one of the first, but it's nothing new that I've read. It's important to be willing to get something out of a piece of literature. I'm not saying this is the best of its kind, but it is one of the first, and I think it's really important to appreciate that. And then finally, we have a little bit of a weird one. This book talks a lot about Christianity, and one of the things that I don't like about the book is that it takes Christianity, it takes all religion, and it puts it together into this like bad thing, right? The issue is not the bad thing, the issue is putting it all together. Sorry, my camera just cut out. Okay. But what I don't think is the correct way to analyze religion is putting it all into this same no sphere, because like, who am I to talk about indigenous people's cultures? Who am I to talk about religions that I have no personal experience in, or that I'm basing my knowledge on people's personal experience with them? And I'm also at a part in the book where this is kind of becoming apparent, and also why it has aged. It is definitely not only is it not PC, but there are some things about this book that are not okay. And one of them is that they go to New Mexico to see these like unconditioned people who are like actually giving birth and all of that stuff. And it's kind of a really weird mishmash between a stereotype of like American Indigenous people and pre-modern people as us, which is obviously a problem because we as non-Indigenous people shouldn't be grouped into the people who we have categorically like abused and committed genocide against. There is no nuance in that depiction of, you know, we're saying things like pueblos, and we're talking about uncleanliness and poverty and aging and all in the same thing. And that's obviously a problem, right? You know, we're talking about our society and we're grouping it in with this incorrect stereotype of Indigenous people. Yeah, that's a huge problem. And if you don't want to read this book because of that, that's fine. I don't think that this needs to be required reading. It's also one of those things where, because the book is so satirical, like the social commentary is so heavy, you may be able to overlook it, because what the book is saying is, can you believe how unreasonable it is for these like modern people, these conditioned test tube people, to look down on humanity as it stands now, right? So there is still the issue with the distinction, and there is still the issue with like conflating poverty and uncleanliness with Indigenous people. But also at the same time, they're painting this scene in such a way that we're supposed to feel disgusted that the characters feel disgusted, because this is all natural to us in a way. Is shaky ground at best, if I'm being honest. But like I said, not required reading, and I'm giving you the PSA so that if you don't want to fucking deal with it, you don't have to deal with it. And that's okay. Anyway, I'm going to continue reading. I'm probably going to try to finish this all in one go. So I will get back to you after. Finished reading at about 7 o'clock, so I've read for approximately 5.5 hours. Now, that does include breaks, meal time, stuff like that. During my active reading, I was reading about a page a minute, so I'm pretty happy with my reading pace. Not that it matters at all, but since I haven't been reading, my attention span's been kind of shit, and I just wanted to hit the ground running, getting back into reading again. I'm pretty happy with my reading performance. Now, to the second half of the book. After I filmed my halfway check-in, I finished the scene at the Pueblos, and I figured out why it's so problematic. The reason why it's problematic is because Aldous Huxley equates these sanitized, modern, conditioned people to that of the, quote, Indian savages. So the only person who is respected is the unconditioned white guy, which was the son of a conditioned woman. So John, aka the Savage, is a non-conditioned person, but is not an Indigenous person. And so equating this conditioned whiteness to this, quote, savage Indigenous culture is a wild thing to do. That's a wild thing to do. It's highly problematic. With all of that being said, the book follows John, Bernard, Leanne, whatever her name was, and this guy like Huxley. I read this so fast, I have not retained anybody's names, as they navigate their society, with John, aka the Savage, kind of being on like studied and interviewed and used as a means of entertainment, because it's this unconditioned savage man who also reads Shakespeare. So, and that's a pretty cool juxtaposition of like calling this man like a savage and then having him have an adequacy in the high arts, right? So there is that. The book is good and I would recommend it only because it is incredible that the ideas and themes and concerns put forth in this book are so relevant today. And the continuous nature of it being relevant is why it has the title of classic. Is it worth it to read knowing that there is not an insignificant portion of the book that is built on the premise that Indigenous people were savages? That is up for you to decide. For me, knowing what I know now about this book, I would still read it because it definitely sets the standard for everything that comes after it in terms of themes, in terms of social conditioning, in terms of what society does with the idea of God, right? That's also put forth toward the end of the book. As a non-spoiler review, besides that one part, yeah, I highly recommend it. I highly recommend it if you are somebody who is getting into science fiction, who is getting into classic literature. This is a pretty good place to start. And I think this is also a pretty good book to kind of give you a litmus on what you're willing to tolerate from, white men in the 1800s. Because knowing what you can and cannot tolerate from white men is going to be pretty important if you're reading anything pre-2000 or even pre-1990, honestly, especially when it comes to science fiction, because what they're trying to do is they're trying to subvert these social norms and these stereotypes and put forth these like futuristic ideas. And a lot of the time they definitely lean into a lot of other stereotypes in order for it to be more palatable, or they don't challenge those stereotypes that they hold and these biases that they hold because they believe themselves to be morally superior. That's not always the case. Sometimes it's just ignorance of the time. But there are times where I have read science fiction and even philosophy, and I'm like, you really think that you are so morally superior when you still hold these extremely problematic views? There is definitely a conversation and like a critique to be had around literature that's built on moral superiority, right? So, and media in general, that can still be said today. White savior complex, anyone? Whatever. But it is a good book. It is a really good book. I would say that it's not the best book that I've ever read. It's not something that has given me any new ideas. But as I said in my like halfway point video, it is something that has helped me solidify and shape and kind of bring into focus my own ideas and my own views. So for that, it is a really useful tool. I'm going to come back in a couple of days with my final thoughts regarding this book after my thoughts and my feelings have given some time to simmer down and marinate, because usually after I finish reading a book, I'm pretty at level 10. Either I love it or I hate it, or I just feel completely apathetic to it. But after a few days, usually I have a more comprehensive understanding of what I liked and what I didn't like, and if the pros outweigh the cons of reading the book. Right now, I'm going to say, yes, I recommend it. Yes, it is problematic, but it is also something that we just kind of have to deal with at this point in reading literature. But there's a whole nother video for that. So I will be back in a little bit for my final thoughts. Honestly, I don't really have many thoughts and feelings on A Brave New World by Aldous Huxley. It's a book that I could take or leave as far as it being part of my reading classic sci-fi repertoire, but I do think that it is a really good starter book for someone who is looking to transition from sci-fi into classic literature, or someone who's looking to transition into sci-fi and genre fiction in general. There are definitely some very problematic views about this book that I have mentioned in my previous clips, such as equating a postmodern conditioned mind to that of native indigenous cultures that are inherently misrepresented in the book due to ignorance and harmful stereotypes. So that especially sways my opinion from, yeah, read it, to, it may not be necessary. I think that you can get a lot out of this book. I think that for the time, it being 150 years old, the ideas presented as far as genetic engineering and conditioning are still relevant today, and also incredibly impressive for the time that the book was written. So for those reasons, I can say that I understand why it holds up. I understand why it's a piece of classic literature. I can understand why it's a piece of classic sci-fi especially. But is it necessary to read to fully understand where the genre comes from? No. I think that commentary regarding society and conditioning and capitalism and all of these things has definitely improved over time. I don't think that this is required reading. But like I said, it's a pretty good book as far as light, digestible reading to get you introduced to the type of literature that talks about ideas and that talks about commentary and that is critical of society. I think that if you liked the ideas and the commentary presented in A Brave New World, you would really like George Orwell's 1984. 1984 is not typically a book that I recommend because personally I did not find it very enjoyable, might not necessarily be the right word, but it's not a book that's pretty high up on my list. But as far as being a book about ideas, 1984 is definitely top of that list, regardless of how I personally feel about it. However, a book that I 100% will recommend at any given point is Kurt Vonnegut's Slaughterhouse-Five. This is an incredible book. This is also a sci-fi book. This is also classic literature. So is 1984. And this is one of my favorite books of all time. I highly recommend this book if you didn't get as much out of this book. I also have like a Slaughterhouse-Five tattoo. That's how much I love this book. If you liked the John the Savage part of this book and kind of this guy who is not part of this conditioned society sort of freaking out about the whole thing, then I would recommend Marie-Helene Bertino's Beautyland. This is also a science fiction book. This book does not get talked about enough. This is also a science fiction book. And this book is about a girl who is an alien born into a human person's body. And she's essentially trying to figure out what makes humanity humanity. And so it very much has that fish out of water. The commentary is through somebody who doesn't understand and isn't part of society's eyes. And 10 out of 10 recommend this book. Now, as far as books that aren't science fiction that definitely drift a lot further into the classic literature category that I would recommend as far as the fish out of water, critiquing society through the lens of someone who inherently doesn't understand it, or who is railing against it, I would recommend Notes from the Underground by Dostoevsky. This is about a man who has classified himself essentially a terrible person, commenting on what it means to do kind things and the reason why we do those things. And it's about selfishness. It's about inherent malice. It's about growing up or being born deformed morally. And that is an incredible book to read. It's kind of stream of consciousness. And then the final book that I would recommend, which is probably the weird one of my recommendations, is going to be The Trial by Kafka. The reason why I recommend The Trial by Kafka is because, once again, this is a book about someone who has been singled out essentially by a society and a justice system, in Kay's case, that makes no sense. And he is desperately trying to figure out how to navigate this without anybody telling him any useful information about it. So I do think that this is also a book that moves along the lines of commenting on society by taking something absurd and putting a reasonable person in that absurd environment. And if you read this book and you enjoy this book, or if you read Notes from the Underground and you enjoyed that, then I do recommend the rest of Kafka's work, because Kafka focuses on absurdism. So like the Metamorphosis being a perfect example. Like, what if one day you turned into a cockroach and everything else totally stayed the same? And, you know, and that book is about, you know, family dynamics and how conditional love really is, and identity as a human being and how much we ascribe to that. So you could easily get from A Brave New World to very many different avenues. And that is the only reason why I would really recommend this book, is because by determining what you like about this book, you have about 3 different avenues to go down as far as, is it the dystopian society? Is it the dystopian society disguised as a utopian society? Is it the strangeness of it all that's highlighted by someone who is otherwise reasonable and rational being put into this situation? Or is it the commentary on society in general that interests you? So you can go in a few different directions with it. I would say I recommend this more than like my personal rating of it. I think that it's really important, and we're going to have this conversation a million times over in this channel, but I think that it's really important to know what your upper limit is as far as reading books from people that not only don't hold up to the like politically correct language of 2026 and the 21st century, but also are inherently problematic regardless of the language. There are plenty of books that don't deserve to be read because the premise is based on racism. The premise is based on sexism. They're trying to make a point that's a problematic point. But then there are other books that are ignorant of these systems because they're created by, I don't know if Aldous Huxley was rich, but white men, right? That don't have the experience or the voice or the forethought to ask someone who has had that experience or a voice to inform their writing. This one is definitely on the brink for me. I'm gonna go back to Wuthering Heights because that's the only other video that's posted on this channel at this point. But with Wuthering Heights, a lot of the book is based on an inherently problematic view, which is why I don't really recommend reading it, because I don't think that it's worth reading because it's based on racism. The whole premise of it is based on racism. This book tried to make its point with outdated, harmful stereotypes as an analogy and a juxtaposition to something else. So it's important to keep in mind. I would say it's about like 2 chapters that you can kind of skip over if you wanted to, and then you could probably just spark notes the summaries of those chapters. So it's definitely not the majority of the book, and for that reason I would say all right, we can let it go. Yeah, so I would say it's about like a 3.5 out of 5 like a 7 out of 10 would recommend, but my personal rating is probably like a 2 out of 5. It was definitely a below, maybe a 2.5 out of 5. It was definitely a below average read for me. And if I had read this maybe like a year and a half in high school or something like that, it would definitely be rated much higher, which is once again why I recommend this book if you want to get into sci-fi, if you want to get whichever way you're going. If you're at a starting point, I would recommend reading this so that you can kind of open up your palette to the heavier commentaries that happen. But other than that, I hope you enjoyed my video. If you read the book, let me know what you thought of it down below. If you read the book because of my video, let me know if your thoughts or feelings toward the book are similar to mine, or if you have thoughts and opinions of your own. I want to hear about it. Also, if you have any recommendations of books that you want me to read and review, also drop those down below. I am happy to read basically anything. I hope you enjoyed my musings on Aldous Huxley's A Brave New World, and I will see you at the next one.